Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of ATP where we discuss policy issues of relevance. My name is Priyal D'Almeida and I'm a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution in Bangalore. And for today's episode, I am joined by Arjun, who is my colleague at Takshashila and who's also a research analyst here. Now, before we get into the topic at hand, we are going to be talking about geoengineering. But before we get into that, I'd like to give a small formal introduction about what Takshashila is and what we do. So, Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and also a school of public policy. And apart from our research that we do, we also have education programs that last one semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. And they are all online and you can take them from anywhere. So admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, as well as technology and policy. And the application deadline for this September 2022 cohort is on the 27th of August. And if you want further information about the courses and how to apply and how to go about it, you can visit school.takshashila.org.in/GCPP. Now, as I said before, the topic today that we are going to be talking about is geoengineering. And Arjun, let's directly get into what it is, right? So what exactly do we mean by geoengineering and why does this matter?
Hey Priyal, thanks so much for having me. So, this is something very interesting which I came across when I was just reading up on stuff. And this is something I wanted to dwell more into. So, I ended up reading about it a lot, understood what is the exact science and the technology behind this. And especially since I am also interested about environmental policy, so I understood how this actually correlates with the existing climate change crisis, right? So every year, the United Nations organizes these conferences like the COP summits, and they bring various states together from across the globe. And they ask how we can tackle this existing climate change, right? And this is a question which has been asked and which does not have a definitive answer anywhere. But there are potential solutions. I mean, the most feasible solutions for us is for the human race to actually reduce the carbon emissions itself, reduce the extent to which global warming can affect the planet and the temperature of Earth itself. Now, if that is not possible, right? I mean, we do understand that there is a major, a difference between developed nations and developing nations in terms of their carbon outputs and how they, I mean, the US itself has got to where it has because of major carbon emissions which were released, I don't know, maybe 200 years back during the Industrial Revolution. So
Right.
there are other countries now which are looking to develop themselves, develop their economies, and the path to that for them is through using fossil fuels, and that's the easiest way for them. And so this has kind of created that divide wherein some people say, no, look, the developed nations should always contribute more towards tackling climate change and all that. So now, I mean, that's the whole argument behind it, and I'm pretty sure everyone else has heard it. But there are different other factors which can be used as mitigation factors itself, and that is that geoengineering comes in, right? So,
Yeah.
in layman's terms, it just refers to the human involvement made in the Earth's natural processes, and this is done to counteract the effects of climate change. So, basically involves large scale interventions of the planet's functioning through human actions in order to mitigate the extent of the crisis itself. So, one of the major principles used in this process is to reduce the CO2 content in the atmosphere through human intervention.
Right.
How do we do this? There are multiple different ways. So this would actually result in trapping less heat in the atmosphere and eventually slowing down the effect of global warming. That is the objective of the field itself. So, and you have to do it through human intervention or some action which is developed by human beings itself. Now, it's basically an alternative to cutting down carbon emission, but there is this whole thing about scientific taboo behind the field because there is research as is at its infancy, and there are some probable implications on the environment itself. So that's the thing. We'll get into that later. But anyways, the field of engineering itself, geoengineering itself, is basically the concept of solar radiation management, wherein you involve like reflecting a fraction of the incoming sunlight to cool down the planet. So I mean, and you can do it with like multiple different ways. Multiple different ways have been tried and tested around. So in this goes way back to I guess 1960s when Lyndon Johnson, the president of the US then, his scientific advisory committee suggested sprinkling reflective particles across the ocean to reduce the absorption of sunlight.
Okay.
So that was suggested way back then. One of the major processes used now is what you call a stratospheric injection. Basically, it involves spraying the reflective aerosols. Aerosols are nothing but gases, which are, let's say, which are used in your fridges and refrigerators and all that. So that they inject it into the stratosphere itself. So when there is incoming sunlight, these reflective aerosols do not let it pass into the atmosphere and do not let it reach the Earth's surface. So that was actually tried by these Russian scientists in what they called as the SPICE project, wherein they ended up pumping particles through a high altitude balloon.
Okay.
So that would scatter once it reached a specific height in the atmosphere. Now, kind of experiments, right? So these are the ones which have been, frowned upon by the scientific community because, you're tinkering with the natural process of
Right, right.
how the earth functions, how the planet functions. And there is this whole concept of what you do might have significant other consequences in terms of blowback and like a chain reaction effect, wherein it can alter precipitation patterns and it can reduce crop growth. And there is also a possibility of this damaging the ozone layer further. So there is always this whole risk factor which is involved in the field. But again, currently, because there are just these one off projects and research which is going on in the geoengineering field, there hasn't been much movement on the framework to govern how this is done. And that is where you need someone to step in and ensure, responsible development of the field.
Right. And also, you talked about like generally, like when we talk about climate technology or climate in general, we know that government is heavily involved in it in some matters, right? Now, when it comes to geoengineering, so where does like regulation and the governance come into picture here?
Yeah, so as I said, right, so it's just the fact that there is this whole concept of how it can create this chain reaction and it can alter the natural processes of the planet itself. I mean,
Right.
so our main objective would be to kind of reduce the carbon. I mean, it would be to use geoengineering as an alternative to reducing carbon emissions and in the process decrease the temperature and limit the effect of climate change. So that would be the major objective for us. Now, once these research projects have been initiated, there is also this possibility of how they can be unregulated and people can go on testing their hypothesis with by tinkering with the existing climate, the working of the climate itself. So that is why you need responsible regulation and governance of the field because otherwise this would not evolve more into a alternative per se, but it would like morph into something that might destroy the planet in a different way. So
Right.
it can have potentially disastrous consequences while trying to mitigate one thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So so that is why you needed you needed some sort of regulation or governance in this
Mm-hmm.
in the development of this field itself, right? So if you go back to 1990s, there was this eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991, which led
Okay.
to the release of 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, this
Wow.
sulfur dioxide gas acted as a reflector of incoming sunlight, and climate scientists at that point of time estimated that this event would lead to a decrease in global temperature about zero point 0.5 degree Celsius over the next 2 years. Now, this shows that there is the possibility of this kind of technology, which is geoengineering. However, this was just a natural,
Event.
process.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So this was just an eruption of the volcano, but it shows that if there are reflectors and if it is possible to reflect incoming sunlight, it this kind of ability to fast track it is a possible solution to mitigate the climate crisis itself. But there has been, I mean, you're releasing 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, right? Now, how will this have another consequence? Like, will this again, potentially have a blowback? Maybe, maybe not, but it does have the possibility of doing that. And now, because geoengineering has already been kind of a scientific taboo in terms of how the scientific field views it,
Mm-hmm.
there has to be effective regulation to say that no, look, we can use this as a plausible alternative with good governance and effective regulation. Because there have been recent calls to completely stop any solar radiation management research. So 60 scholars, like mostly from the West, they argued for a moratorium on the research in the field. So they signed what is called as the International Solar Geo Non-Use Agreement. They said basically that the concept of geoengineering and solar radiation management, which basically involves the reflection of sunlight, that is still theoretical, and reflecting large amounts of sunlight can damage existing ecosystems and potentially harm human settlements.
Right.
Now, yeah, this is a very a made point to be raised, because otherwise, if people are allowed to continue with their research and continue with making, I mean, testing out their projects on the atmosphere itself or on the climate itself, there that it can go haywire. But the question here comes where, like, should the research of the field completely be banned just because of the fact that it can have potential negative
Side effects,
consequences?
negative one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is where, the regulation aspect comes in, wherein you have to kind of build good framework, regulatory framework, to ensure that there is a proper way to, continue the research in the field itself. And which is essential because, I mean, we are finding any solution which can mitigate the existing climate crisis should be looked into without having to dismiss it, right? So if this can work, then might as well actually look into it.
Yeah, fair enough. That's actually quite interesting. And also, like, even if I'm pretty sure, like, a lot of these things are at their very nascent stage, the research and stuff. So, getting the governance and all involved in this particular stage would actually be more important, right? When it's just starting out
Yep.
and stuff.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah. Now, actually, Arjun will continue with this conversation ahead and we'll talk more about geoengineering and everything. But before that, let's take a short break and we will be right back. Hello and welcome back to this ATP episode. And we were discussing, Arjun and I were talking about geoengineering and the governance aspect of it and stuff. Now, Arjun, continuing with our previous conversation that we were having. So, what do you think should be the course of action in terms of, like the development versus like the deployment of geoengineering climate tech?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, there has to be a well rounded governance framework, basically
Right.
regulating the research and technology in the field. So that is one thing. Now,
Hmm.
while ethical consideration must be taken into account, there also has to be a holistic model to have solar radiation management or basically geoengineering as a probable climate policy option for any kind
Okay.
of state, right? So
Yeah.
how we can do this? You can set up national agencies which can fund this kind of research, basically geoengineering and solar tech research, and also
Right.
keep tabs on the experiments being conducted, because these experiments has to be conducted in a regulated manner wherein they cannot completely dismiss the potential consequences of it, but also
Right.
the fact that they can slowly translate the research into possible application. So incentivizing development in the field kind of has to be the priority. So considering the fact that the historical criticism of the field and the concept of unanticipated or unintended consequences of human actions on tinkering with existing climate itself, the
Right.
framework which there has to be like suppose the governance framework itself kind of has to be robust enough to account for any sort of negative consequences of the field, because
Right.
it should try to predict what can happen, what might be the possible consequences of going ahead with this research and deploying this as a possible alternative to tackle climate change. So the responsible use of these techniques must be a priority, and the
Hmm.
fact that degradation of the existing environment because of human intervention should be taken care of, because this should be an integral part of this governing mechanism, basically because you should ensure that instead of degrading the environment further, you
Right.
kind of have to move in the other way and try to account for positive effects of the environment
Right.
itself.
Right.
And also the fact that there has to be a mechanism to only go ahead with deployment of these with this climate technology only when considerable research has been conducted and effects have been identified, so potential
Right.
effects. So this is something, I mean, this is just a primer to how the governance aspect of the field can look in the near future. Because,
Right.
I mean, anyone can, you need someone to take up that responsibility of forming this kind of governing mechanism and governing framework. Because if everyone dismisses it, then and it is treated more like a hindrance rather than a mitigation.
You're right. That's true. But like, you mentioned this before also that, the scientific community in the West is completely against using this kind of tech, right? But a lot of times we look up to West for, a lot of these things. But like, are there any other states that can sort of drive this initiative?
Yeah, I mean, see, I just said that because of the fact that this has been tried in some countries such as the UK and Russia and stuff like that, but not everyone has been successful in their attempt. But I guess, see, the thing is, as I said in the beginning of the podcast, there's this whole divide between the developed and the developing world. So
Right.
there have been, kind of mismatches between the two factions in terms of how to deal with it, because
But
the developing world says there has to be climate financing in terms of the fact that the other side, which has developed already, should finance any sort of climate change efforts in the other countries because they're still on the developing path. So, in saying all that, I think India and China, which are like traditionally on the opposite ends of the spectrum regarding most issues,
yeah.
are on the same page with regard to tackling the climate crisis itself. Because
Yeah.
both of them consider themselves to still be developing nations in terms of
Mhm.
the fact that they did not go through that whole concept of the industrial revolution and the
Mhm.
manufacturing boom and all that stuff. And they consider themselves to be kind of the torch bearers for the developing nations itself while tackling
Right.
climate. So, and the fact that they're two of the top three net carbon emitting countries in the world, other than
Yeah.
US. So they have a convergent view on most of the things which are climate change related. So the fact that there have been specific goals which have been set at these COP summits, wherein there is there's the agenda of meeting the 1.5 degrees Celsius global temperature threshold. Like you shouldn't cross the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark in the
Mhm.
next, I think, 15 to 20 years. the fact that it is a responsible and collective action of the entire world
Hmm.
makes it seem that everyone is involved with, make at least trying to, follow the goals which have been set. And
Right.
in terms of that, there is the need to speed up the process of reducing carbon emission. And that is why alternative solutions are being proposed to speed up the
Hmm.
process itself. And
Yeah, yeah.
that is where geoengineering comes in, right? So India and China had the possibility of driving forward the conversation of continuing credible research in the field of
Right.
geoengineering, because they can both work together to formulate like a good governance framework, because
Hmm.
not it hasn't been done, and you can actually kind of sit down and regulate the research and technology in the field. And if this is indeed like a fast track solution or a potential alternative to tackle climate change, developing countries can use this and use these kind of techniques to meet their climate goals. and
Right.
uh, and both India and China can help them doing that. So, and it's also in the interest of both India and China to advocate for a enhanced research environment in the geoengineering field, because
Right.
India and China are the top two most populated countries on this planet,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it
yeah.
is very hard for them to completely cut down on carbon emissions. I mean, India has this goal of going completely carbon neutral by 2070, which is very, very ambitious considering the fact that many of us are still dependent on fossil fuels to run our
Yeah.
daily life. And
Right.
the fact that renewable energy is not that easy to translate into usable applications itself. And you
Yeah.
need a lot of money also. At some point of time, you need to figure out some kind of alternative to tackle the climate change crisis, as well as keep your inflow of energy sources at the same level.
Right.
So, in that way, you can this can change the way different states approach tackling climate change and
Hmm.
meeting their goals itself. So I get it, the fact that this whole concept of geoengineering and solar radiation management has been widely debated,
Hmm.
but the fact that there has to be responsible development of the field, and you cannot block it or stymie it just by keeping in mind what effects it might throw up later. Because
Right. Right.
I mean, like, the climate crisis has already been exacerbated, and any solution must be explored before dismissing it. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, I think India and China can play a crucial role in this. And the fact that if they can develop a way to regulate and govern this kind of climate tech, then we can actually figure out whether, this can be used in a responsible way
Hmm.
as a mitigation tool. I mean, if it's not possible and if it has potentially massive consequences on the way these natural processes are, then yeah, let's not use it.
Yeah.
But if you can actually kind of understand and research into the field wherein climate scientists can actually delve into what this might throw up and how it might have an impact, you can see whether the pros outweigh the cons or the
Right.
other way around.
Right.
And that's the only way to determine whether it might work.
Yeah. Also, like, I think let's not dismiss this too soon, right? Because let's have enough evidence to show that there are more, severe consequences of it rather than just dismissing it right in the beginning when there's not enough studies to justify if this is like a credible way of like moving ahead.
Yeah,
Because,
yeah,
yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, there's so much of damage done. If there's something, if there is some technology that could potentially fasten up the process of, solving this issue, then why not tap into it, right? Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
definitely.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you, Arjun, for joining me in this conversation. And this was very, very informative, especially because, like, I didn't know what geoengineering was until, like, you mentioned about it. And this was nice having a conversation with you.
Yeah, sure, Priyal. Thank you so much. I hope the listeners also enjoyed it. And
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it was just, I just came across this randomly at some point of time and I decided to look into it. I'm pretty sure
Yeah. Yeah.
someone might also. So hopefully.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Arjun. And to our listeners, I hope you continue listening to our podcast in the future. Bye bye. Take care.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.